I have handled the Vane family's legal affairs for 31 years. Births, marriages, 2 ugly divorces, 1 quiet one, a handful of wills. I have sat at their tables and drunk their wine and nodded at their anecdotes, and I have watched that household the way a man watches a fire he did not light carefully, at a safe distance, ready to step back if it shifts. But the night of Edmund Vane's wake is the one I cannot set down. I have tried. I have told it at dinner tables badly. I have begun it in a letter to my brother and stopped at the 3rd paragraph because the words came out smaller than the thing itself. So I will try again now from the beginning, and I will do my best not to ruin it. Edmund died on a Tuesday. He was 73, a former concert pianist turned something rarer, a composer who had spent the last 20 years of his life in the Wiltshire house writing music that almost nobody had heard, for an audience he described, without bitterness, as the future. He was not a sad man. He was a man who had placed his best work somewhere no one could find it yet, and he was content to wait. His housekeeper was a young woman named Mara Solis. She had come to work for him 7 years earlier, at 24, on the recommendation of a neighbor who told her only that the old pianist was not difficult but particular. She took the position without knowing anything about him. She learned who he was gradually, the way you learn the layout of a house in the dark, by bumping into things, then remembering where they were. She had no formal training. She had grown up in a small town outside Oporto, the daughter of a mechanic who kept a second-hand upright in the front room because his own father had kept one. She could play, in the loose way that some people can, haltingly, by ear, with a sound that was more feeling than form. She did not play for anyone. It was not something she advertised. Edmund Vane knew because Edmund Vane noticed everything. He noticed it the same week she arrived, when he came downstairs late at night to find her at the Steinway in the music room, her hands on the closed lid, not playing, just touching the grain of the wood the way you touch the spine of a book you've been forbidden to open. He didn't say anything. He went back upstairs. He told me about it the following month over a chess game he was losing, and he said, "She has the hands for it. I wonder if she knows." I never asked him what he meant by that. I should have. I have thought about it many times since. He died at 6 in the morning, alone, which was how he had wanted it. By noon the family had arrived, his son Oliver, his daughter Claire, her husband, 2 grandchildren who were teenagers and visibly bored by grief, and a cluster of what I can only describe as social satellites, people who had attended enough of Edmund's earlier recitals to claim a kind of ownership over the morning. By 3 o'clock, the house was full of food that nobody had asked for and conversation that circled the same 6 anecdotes without ever landing. Mara moved through all of it like a woman who had somewhere to be. She brought things in and took things out. She answered the door. She did not cry in front of anyone, which Oliver, I noticed, took as evidence of something, I was not sure what. The music room had been closed since Edmund died. It was not a formal arrangement. No one had locked it. It was the kind of closing that happens by instinct, the way people step around a bruise without being told to. The Steinway was in there, a Hamburg concert grand that Edmund had acquired in his 50s, and which he had told me more than once was the best decision he had ever made. He played it every morning without exception. He had played it the morning before he died. The housekeeper was the last person to hear it, through the kitchen ceiling. I was standing near the fire in the drawing room when I heard the door open. Mara had gone in. I don't know what drew her there at that particular moment. Maybe it was the only room in the house that didn't have someone in it performing a version of sorrow. She sat down at the bench, and she put her hands in her lap, and for a moment she only looked at the keyboard. She had not touched it before. 7 years, and she had never played it. Edmund had never asked her to, and she had never offered. It was his instrument the way a man's handwriting is his, not because he owned the paper, but because the marks it made were irreplaceably his. Oliver saw her from the doorway. He was 3 glasses of wine past steady, which I say not to diminish him but to account for what followed. He said, from the hall, That piano has not been played by staff in the 40 years this family has owned it. My father would find this rather extraordinary." Mara looked up. She said very quietly, "I know, I'm sorry." She moved to stand. A man I knew slightly, a former record producer named Garrett, who had done some work with Edmund in the early years, said, from behind Oliver's shoulder, with a smile that belonged at a different kind of gathering, "Oh, let her. I'd like to see what she makes of it." Oliver looked at Mara the way people look at something they are about to make a point with. "By all means," he said, "play one note that doesn't embarrass him, and I will apologize to you on my knees." Garrett laughed. Someone else further back in the hall laughed too. Mara sat back down. "I want to be precise about what happened next, because it matters how it started. She did not launch into anything. She did not announce herself or adjust the bench or make a performance of settling in. She put her hands on the keys the way you put a hand on the shoulder of someone who is crying, without announcement, without asking permission, without any of the self-consciousness that the moment seemed to demand. She played the opening of the Fauré Nocturne in D-flat, the sixth. If you know it, you know what it asks of the hands, the patience it requires, the way it seems to move at the speed of thought rather than technique, the way a lesser player makes it sound like a very beautiful thing being described from memory, and a true player makes it sound like the thing itself. She played it like the thing itself. I learned later that Edmund had taught her. Not in any formal sense. There had been no lessons, no assigned etudes, no correction of finger position. What had happened, as best I can reconstruct it, was something quieter than teaching. He had simply stopped closing the music room door. After the first year, he played with it open. She went about her work in the rooms nearby, and the music reached her the way it reaches anyone who is willing to stop and receive it, not all at once, but over time, in the way rivers learn the shape of stone. On winter evenings, when the house was settled, he would sometimes call her in and play through a passage and ask her what it reminded her of. Not what she knew about it. He had no interest in testing her knowledge. He wanted what she heard. She told me, much later, that he used to say she had the cleanest ears in the house, because she listened without the interference of having been educated. Once in the third year he had sat beside her at the bench and placed her hands on the keys and said, "Show me what you hear." She played back a phrase of the Fauré, imperfectly, haltingly, by ear. He did not correct her. He listened with his eyes closed, and when she finished he said only, "Yes, that," and stood up and went back to his desk. That was the whole lesson. There were no others, but she had been carrying it for 4 years since, inside her hands, waiting. The hallway went quiet in sections. Oliver first, who stopped mid-breath. Then Garrett, whose smile dissolved without his seeming to notice. Then the rest of them, one by one, the way lights go out in a house at night, room by room, until the whole building is dark and still. She played the nocturne through to the end and let the last note go. Silence. Then she began something else. I recognized it immediately and felt the recognition like a hand on my sternum. It was Edmund's. Not the Fauré, this was his own. The piece he had been writing for the last 3 years, the one he had played fragments of on those mornings she had heard through the kitchen ceiling, the one that had never been finished, that existed only in the pages of a manuscript on his writing desk upstairs, and in the air of a house that had, for 7 years, been her home. She played it from memory, not from the manuscript, from having heard it morning after morning, note by note, phrase by phrase, in the way you learn a language not by studying it but by living inside it until the sounds stop being foreign. And she finished it. I don't know how. I am not a musician and I cannot tell you in technical terms what she did at the point where the written notes ran out. What I can tell you is that it did not sound like guesswork. It sounded like inevitability. It sounded like the last line of a poem you did not know you already knew, and when she played it you thought, yes, of course. That is how it ends. The music room was full by now. Everyone in the house had drifted in without deciding to, the way water finds the lowest point. The two teenage grandchildren were standing in the doorway with their mouths open. Claire had her hand over her lips. The former record producer had taken his glasses off and was holding them in one fist, staring at the floor. Oliver had not moved from the place where he'd been standing when he made his wager. Mara held the final chord. She held it until it had said everything it had to say and then a little longer. Then she lifted her hands and placed them in her lap, the same way she'd begun, and looked at the keys. The room did not erupt. That is the thing I keep trying to explain to people who expect this kind of story to go that way. There was no ovation. What there was instead was the particular silence that comes after something true, not the silence of shock but the silence of recognition, when a room full of people has just understood something all at once, and none of them knows how to be the first to speak. Claire was crying. Quietly, in that way that isn't the performance of grief but the grain of it, the kind of crying that happens when something has gotten past every defense you built against it. Oliver had not apologized, but he was no longer standing in the doorway. He had walked slowly across the room and sat down with his back against the wall beside the piano, not on a chair, not in the composed posture of a man managing a difficult evening, but down on the floor, like a person whose legs had made a decision independently. He sat there with his hands between his knees and looked at nothing. I thought of Edmund, who had sat at this same instrument for 20 years writing music for an audience he had called the future. I thought about a young woman who had stood on the other side of a door for 7 of those years and listened. I thought about the piece that was now, in some form I couldn't name, finished. Mara sat for a moment longer. Then she stood, smoothed her skirt with both hands, the same small gesture she made when she'd cleared a table or answered a door, and walked out of the room. She did not look at Oliver. She did not look at any of them. I found her 20 minutes later in the kitchen, washing the crystal that had accumulated from the afternoon. The water was running. She had her back to the door. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what I would have said. After a moment I walked in and picked up a dish towel and began drying the glasses she set on the rack, and we stood there together in that until the house quieted down around us. The manuscript was still on Edmund's writing desk. It was the first thing Oliver dealt with the following week when the estate work began. He had a restorer come down from London to assess the condition of the pages. On the last page, the one that stopped mid-phrase, exactly where any of us would have said the piece simply ended, Edmund had written a single note in the margin, in pencil. It said, "She'll know." I have thought about whether Edmund intended Mara to find that page, or whether he wrote it for himself, or whether he wrote it for no one, because some things are written into the air rather than for any particular reader. I don't know. I don't think it matters. What I know is this. When people in the village speak of that night now, and they do, because these things travel, they say that the piano played by itself on the night he died. They are not entirely wrong. They have simply misunderstood what the word asterisk itself means in music, when the right hands are the ones playing.